Welcome and thank you for listening to the Civic Space today with Southern Defenders. In this podcast, we explore the status of the civic and political space in the Southern Africa region. We unpack critical issues that shape the space. My name is Madata Ndloja and I am your host. Today, I'm joined by Yanga Malotana, Program Manager for Project Bot, to discuss the May 29 elections in South Africa and the critical human rights issues surrounding them. The 2024 elections in South Africa raised several crucial human rights questions essential for ensuring a fair, inclusive, and democratic process. These questions touch on various aspects of the electoral process, from voter participation and media freedom to human rights protection mechanisms and inclusion strategies for marginalized groups. In this episode, we aim to unpack some of these pressing issues and probably more. So, Yanga, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Madata. I'm honored to be here, and hello to your listeners as well.
So we always like to start our podcast with our guests introducing themselves. So in your own words, who is Yanga Malotana? What does she do? And what has been your involvement in this year's election build-up?
Sure, no problem. So I work for an organization called Emerger Scholars Initiative. We are based at the University of Pretoria. We have got three branches in the work that we do. We have our press, we have our labs, and we have our reach. Our press focuses on book publications. And over there, we are an open access platform. We believe in making all of our books for free and accessible to everybody. So all our books are digital books, and anyone can access them at any time. And one of the books that we actually published recently in support of the elections is a book by Nicholas Bauer called Easy Election Guide, Who to Vote For in 2024, in which the book breaks down all of the different major party positions in the upcoming elections. Then our second branch, which is Labs, which is a little bit more of the branch that I am involved with. That's the branch where we do future-based thinking research and do a little bit more civic work in that particular branch. And under that branch, we have a project that we call Future Democracies. And in Future Democracies has been split currently between two things where we look at coalitions. And the second is a project that we work with the IEC in terms of voter education and civic education surrounding democracy. And that's Project Vote, that's my baby. And then the third is Reach, in which we help different academic authors have their ORCID IDs publicized a bit more in some of their work. But in terms of the focus that I have there in ESI Press, I focus on civic education, I focus on democracy, and I focus on forecasting when it comes to democratic processes. And so naturally, the university had selected me and my colleague to be experts, I guess, around elections. And we have a series called Elections Decoded, in which we break down different facets of these elections and different considerations that we think South Africans are going to be thinking about when they head to the polls on the 29th of May. So yeah, that's pretty much it, the long and short of it.
Wow, I'm actually glad I didn't say your bio because I feel like you said it better. It's extensive, but you said it in such a beautiful summary. So we're going to get into the details of most of those things to talk about. And I love the fact that in all of the work that you're doing, like you are a perfect fit for this conversation about the election. You might want to give us a bit of a political, social, economic context within which this election is being held.
Right, yeah. So this is our 2024 elections here in South Africa. I believe this is our sixth round of national elections, specifically since 1994. It's a very crucial election for different reasons. I think different parties will articulate for themselves why it is such a crucial election, but from a democratic perspective, this is also our 30th anniversary of South Africa having a democracy, which was established in 1994 when we had our first free and fair elections. And so it's somewhat placed us in a position of reflecting on our democratic journey, these 30 years. What have these 30 years produced for South Africa? What has democracy produced for South Africa and the health of democracy in the country? And moreover than that, it's also questioning how do the next 30 years and next 60 years, next 100 years of democracy in South Africa going to look like. So I think it's a very reflective election point, but also a very future thinking election point.
I love that so much because there's been a lot of conversation about how, this election is particularly different. And I think one of the things that's been mentioned a lot is how there's almost over 50 political parties that are actually contesting in this year's election.
Right.
There's a lot of things going on. And I think for most people, there's this moment where people are waiting to see this election somehow turn the South African landscape in ways that we're not familiar with. Is this something that you're saying?
Yeah, there's somewhat of that looming expectation, while simultaneously, if you look at the way that voter registration has come out for this election, this last voter registration cycle that the IEC had done, there was less voters registered than ever before in South Africa's history when it comes to voting. So it's interesting that there's conversations about it being a pivotal moment in our history, while at the same time, there's a clear indicator that there's disillusionment where people don't want to participate in the electoral process. And so it's interesting and in the sense of it's pushed South Africa to come to a crossroads where questions are being asked. Why is this election so pivotal? Is it because it's the 30-year mark? Or is it because of the circumstances within these 30 years that have placed South Africans in a solid place of disillusionment to the point where they didn't, a big chunk of them didn't register for these elections? And if anything, it's indicative of South Africans feeling frustrated on some of the issues that have been consistent over the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years that seem not to be resolved or getting worse. And these are kind of like the core issues that South Africans have issues about, right? It's the big top three. It has to do with unemployment, it has to do with education quality, and it has to do with crime and poverty. And sub two to those has to do with load shedding, and it has to do with corruption. And you're having South Africans looking at how these five things continue to be an issue in this 30-year democracy, and the question on whether or not that will actually be flipped over is being discussed a lot in this election. And while at the same time, the numbers are indicating that people are not going to go out and vote because they've not even registered to vote, but they clearly have frustrations with the fact that these have been the consistent issues for the past 10 to 15 years.
Like I actually find that very interesting because on one hand, we're saying that there's actually an increase in the number of political parties contesting, which you would expect to translate to an increase in the number of people registered to vote
Right,
this year,
right.
because of the broader, spectrum of alternatives, but it seems to be the opposite.
I would say that despite the mass, because before even we knew that there was going to be just over 50 parties on the ballot itself. I think there's well over 300 that are registered with the IEC, and it's a massive proliferation from the previous national elections. I would have believed that some significant change would happen, or these parties would be, if there was one particular significant party that was bringing something changing or something different, if there had been a change in the number of eligible voters that registered and an increase in those numbers. That would have told me that there's clearly a powerhouse that exists that has made it possible for those that seem to have given up and are continuing to give up in our process to decide, I do want to vote. And now we are heading into these elections with a small voting pool, but a large number of political parties. And therein lies the question of how much of the messaging within these 50 parties that are going to be on those ballots seems the same. And whether or not those parties have done anything to make it look like they're going to be doing something different. And if they were going to be doing something different, I think we would have seen more numbers of voter registrations. And if anything, it's been the opposite. It's been less numbers of voter registration.
That's actually true. I think ideally when people get tired of one political option, it should be that you give
Yeah.
up on this one, but you're seeing an alternative and you move towards that. But when people are actually moving away from the process itself, that's a bit
Mm,
concerning. And like one of the
mm,
other things I wanted to ask maybe was around just it was going to be around the influence of the average voter that has registered, like what is
mm.
being done to ensure that those that are actually registered actually understand the power that I have. And maybe you can tie that into some of the work that you do with Project Vote.
Yeah, sure. So, what we've come to find with Project Vote is particularly with young people, because that's the demographic that we're trying to figure out on why they don't want to vote. We kind of going a little bit against the norm. Political campaigners, there's quite a few of us actually on the team who used to work on political campaigns. We will tell you that we don't even bother considering young people when it comes to election season, because it's a waste of time instead of focusing on our base voters and people that we are certain are going to come out and vote for us. Versus now us trying to figure out the language specifically that young people are trying to express themselves in terms of where they're standing with the democratic process. And what we've come to find is oftentimes young people articulate the idea and they will even start questioning, well, I don't even think democracy is for me. Perhaps we need to look at other systems that would work. And often it's anger that's directed towards, firstly, lack of representation, and secondly, lack of trust in the current leaders that we have. And the third is it's an anger that's targeted towards democratic governance than it is towards democratic principles. And we know our democratic principles have to do with the idea of loving representation, the ideas of freedom, the ideas of liberty, of equality. Almost rarely will young people say, I do not want equality, I do not want freedom, I do not, that's not necessarily a conversation that happens. And so we've come to find that the frustration that is there is with the processes of democratic governance, because they have not prioritized young people at all. And where they've attempted to prioritize young people, there's been a homogenous application of the youth, of seeing all young people the same, to have the same issues, which is a problem. And usually in political campaigns, for example, we would say, okay, well, we won't necessarily focus on the young vote. We have to move on from that. But it becomes a concern for South Africa when you consider the fact that a majority of our population in South Africa, just like the rest of the African continent, is young. We have to listen at the language that young people are attempting to express on how they would like to engage with the electoral process. And so if young people feel as though their vote doesn't count, the issue there isn't them necessarily saying that they don't care for democracy. There's a frustration with the link of the leaders that are supposed to be implementing democratic governance. And so in Project Vote, we attempt to step into that point and trying to firstly help young people develop the language of the frustration that they might have through civic education, through showing them the role of the IEC, for example, the role of their vote, how does their vote actually count in the PR system, and how it is possible that every single vote counts, literally because of us having a PR system in South Africa, to then the next level of engaging with leaders and saying that there's not been much effort in engaging with the young audience, and that is the new generation that is coming up, and the generation that is severely affected by the decisions that you are making now. And so we need to find a common language of engagement. And I think Project Vote attempts to come into the middle of that, of saying we acknowledge that there's frustration clearly amongst our young people, but we shouldn't let that frustration push our young people into thinking that democracy is not good at all. If when anything, they are mad with the byproduct of democracy that is expected to be upheld, which is that democratic governance. And with democratic governance comes conversations with leaders that are linked to political maturity. And due to the fact that there's a lack of political maturity within the democratic governance space in South Africa, then of course it's expected that that disconnect exists. And so we attempt to enter that space. It's a little bit difficult because you can imagine going to a leader and saying that you're not politically mature. It can be a bit of a controversial conversation, but these are the conversations that we believe are very crucial in ensuring that our democracy remains healthy for another 30 years.
I love that because, as you're saying, like these are conversations that can be a bit uncomfortable and awkward, but someone needs to have them, especially on behalf of these young people. Because, like, every time we talk about how young people, are the largest demographic in the continent in our countries, at the core of my thoughts is the fact that we are the primary recipients of the services that those people that are elected into power actually have to deliver. We are the people that are most affected by the law. So when we are not involved, somehow we're giving the responsibility to someone else to actually, make those decisions for us to determine the quality of service. So I love the fact that you're focusing on young people and recognizing the limitations that are there and trying to kind of just push back and ensure that you counter them. I also wanted to just speak into just the inclusion of other marginalized groups. If you're looking at women, the LGBT community, persons with disability, and other marginalized groups in South Africa, do you see any efforts that were intentionally made to somehow ensure that there's participation of these particular groups?
Credit where credit's due. You can, and it's not me being biased at all at this moment, considering the IEC pays majority of my bills. You can tell that for this particular voter registration period, and the campaigns that the IEC has done around it, you can tell there's young blood that's helping them out, particularly on the social media side of things. And not just young blood, but conscientious young blood, because this is probably the most accessible and thoroughly explained electoral process that I've seen compared to the other ones. And I'm thinking, just as an example off the top of my head, that there was a video that was released explaining the 3 different ballots that people can expect when they go and vote. But the video was explaining it with subtitles on it, and a person was signing, and there was a person narrating at the same time. And it's layers of intersectionality like that that I recognize and excite me on. I'm happy that it's happening, but it should have happened even sooner in terms of our democracy. We tend to forget about our disabled communities. And then in terms of the civil society space, of course, different civil societies have got different priority areas that they are focusing on. And oftentimes civil society spaces are focusing on exactly just that, the minorities in some light or another. So it's been pretty consistent in the civil society space, the call for political parties to consider minorities, to also write their policies in a way that considers minorities. But in terms of political parties themselves, I can't for one come out and say there's been a party that has been explicitly clear in terms of its advocacy for minorities. It hasn't been its running line. Almost for every single party, the issues that they are focusing on for these elections are the issues of unemployment, these consistent issues I mentioned earlier, the issues of unemployment, issues of education, issues of poverty and crime, and every party is answering in its own way how they would plan to curb those issues. Now, while those issues can affect South Africans indiscriminately, I think what has been missing from the political parties is a layered conversation on how these issues affect minorities. So somewhat of an intersectional conversation. So if you're talking about unemployment, often what's popped up is there's high levels of unemployment in South Africa, and it's young people. But the conversation never goes a step further of how many of those young people are women, particularly considering that majority of the electorate that participates in elections, 55% of it is women. So how many women are not employed? And take it another lens further of intersectionality with unemployment, how many people from the LGBTQ plus community are unemployed, and what's the correlation with it, with crimes and poverty specifically, especially when you are considering gender-based violence in the country, right? We know that there's a massive displacement of members of the LGBTQ plus community who come to Joburg for safety, oftentimes leaving their smaller towns, and they end up being homeless when they come to Johannesburg. And in the process of them being homeless, the story often goes that they'll either end up going into prostitution in an attempt to try to make money, and if not that, end up in some way or another being sex trafficked. So those layered issues, I must say, I don't think there's been a party that has made a concerted effort to speak to them. And I think this is the space where civil society has been calling out political parties on, you need to watch how you campaign. You're not campaigning to homogenous groups of people. There's different experiences in different pockets of South Africa. How unemployment affects a white girl, for example, in the suburbs of Waterkloof over here in Pretoria, who's living with her parents, and her parents have money and they can still give her pocket money, and she's still looking for a job. A frustrating scenario that she's in is a very different scenario than a young Black woman in Khayelitsha, for example, who is sitting in a shack and is trying to decide on whether or not to save money to buy data in order to be able to buy bread, to save money, sorry, to be able to buy data to apply for jobs, or to use that data money to be able to buy bread. And so these different layered experiences, I think, haven't quite been articulated in our political campaigns. And I think a part of it has to do with finances, really, campaign financing. I think there isn't money to make things complex and to have intersectional conversations in South Africa. And I think it's problematic, and it's things that we have to consider when we're thinking about the health of our democracy.
100%. And I find it very strange that political parties wouldn't, design their campaigns, their manifestos around this, because you would think that what they're promising the people is actually cognizant of who those people are, what their needs are, and how diverse they are. So when you're not recognizing that, in my mind, I'm like, what are you promising and what are you promising? How are you going to deliver to a community that you don't understand? But the other thing I wanted us to talk about is just around other specific human rights issues that you feel are most pertinent in this election, and a reflection on some of maybe the mechanisms that are currently in place to protect human rights during this election process.
I think the biggest one that has come out with this election has been the utilization of identity politics. And in the utilization of identity politics, the byproduct of othering and the blasting of that othering. I think South Africa has had a culture of othering, particularly foreign nationals in the country, for quite some time, but I don't think we've ever seen it being blasted at this level towards national elections, where there are parties that are campaigning for the mass removal of people attempting to try to make a living for themselves in South Africa. And so I think there's a need for us to conscientiously watch what does it mean to want mass deportations of peoples, particularly people who have come to South Africa to seek refuge, people who have come to South Africa to seek asylum. What does that look like? And if you're going to run on a campaign that they're all the same, the idea of undocumented migrants, why is there a product of enemizing those people, saying that they're enemies, and so that's the biggest one I would say has come out of these elections. Another one, perhaps less prominently so, is the utilization of race politics to conflate statistics or to manipulate statistics, particularly when you think about the farm killings, for example, where farm killings have become a racial issue instead of it being a crime issue, and political parties running with it from a racial format. We think of the fact that there's been instances throughout this election period where you've had people who are, proudly flying up the apartheid flag, which is, my opinion, very treasonous and, very toxic, and the controversial, AI burning and hypothetical burning of the South African flag, the one thing that identifies us, in the name of doing a campaign. So I think there've been these different moments where a person has to just peek their eye open a little bit, like, where are you taking this? Where's this going? Because constitutionally, there's protection for all of these discrepancies that are being attempted to be used in the name of winning an election. And I find that those moments a little bit dangerous. But luckily, again, our constitution, I think, is a good framework in showing how protection can happen in those circumstances, and the gazillion international treaties that we have signed related to some of these issues gives me at least the hope that hopefully these leaders are aware that there are different mechanisms of accountability when such conversations occur.
Whether it's generated by AI or not, the idea that someone is comfortable with banning a flag that represents the foundation of the country because it's part of the country's identity, it's creating a precedent that after the election or during this time and after, people feel it's okay to do certain things that disrespect the country just to push the numbers or just to get some clickbait. But then I wanted to ask something else, because when you talk about human rights protection, human rights issues, part of the concern is always concern around the election day itself, where in some instances people are okay with people having different views. So tolerance can exist in certain spaces, but there are some spaces where people are not able to be okay with someone else having certain opinions or having a certain preference for political parties, political interests. Has there been any sense of a potential threat for violence at a lower scale, higher scale? And also, if that's something that could potentially occur, what are the kind of mechanisms in place that ensure that people know they are safe? They also know how to be safe.
Yeah, so one of the first things is the importance of the observers when it comes to the elections, even though sometimes we all know that sometimes even observers can be slightly threatened by words when it comes to the election day. But there's a mandate that the electoral officer who is at all the different voting stations, that if they sense that there's any form of violence that may occur, they have every single right to contact and inform it to the IEC, where the IEC deals with it as part of Section 55, as part of its dispute. And there will be an assurance that police officers will be dispatched in those areas. And I think this conversation about the safety concern comes, post the July 2021 unrests, and kind of just the byproduct of President Zuma being arrested and the people that were killed as a result of it. And now that the MK party is also running, even though President Zuma won't be able to sit as an MP afterwards, I think there's definitely a concern in KZN specifically when it comes to this particular issue. And so I do know for a fact that the IEC has committed to ensuring that there's security services that are available at those different voting stations to kind of attempt to ensure that peace is there and, no one feels intimidated. This is, of course, now coming to another layered issue in terms of that corruption crime link, because This is the same KZN that has got high levels of political assassinations, firstly, and also the same KZN that has got high levels of police corruption, where police are actively participating in assisting massive crimes that are occurring in areas such as Umlazi. And so I think I understand the fear that is around that, and it's very terrifying to me that a party alone made it possible for people to fear going to go vote for any other said party, but it is illegal for any party to intimidate individuals at a voting station to vote for a different party. So there are different legal mechanisms. My only hope is that the right people are deployed to those particular stations and the right people are able to ensure that the peace is kept. But I would like to see the brighter side of South Africans, including the MK party, that this will be a respected electoral process, and the outcome will also be respected as part of our PR democracy, as ruled by the Constitutional Court, the highest court in the land. And so, yeah, I can't say there'll be violence, but also at the same time, I can't say that there won't be violence. It's up in the air.
That's true, but also that's just like our hope. And I think this election, as much as it's yours, it's also a regional election. We are all just looking, and we're looking to learn, because you know how South Africa is a very strategic country in the Southern African region as well. So whatever happens in South Africa, by extension, also has an impact on the region itself. So we're also hoping for peaceful election. Um, the other thing that I want us to talk about before we wrap up is just the media landscape in South Africa. As you've been evolving into this particular election, how has the media been playing a role in the lead to the election?
I think the media, specifically in the couple of weeks leading up to elections, usually media, right, covers elections at about the 12-week mark. Then they start hinting towards it, and then it's everyday segments from about the 2-month mark and so on. And I think they had a very focused and concerted effort towards young people, which was very interesting to me, in the way that they are covering the news and have continued to want to have conversations about young people, despite the fact that young people continue to be the lowest demographic that's registered for the elections, which I find very interesting. I think it has done somewhat of a good balance of having the different political leaders present their cases directly. I think this is one of the very few election cycles that I can think of where there was continuous debates and debates in different forums from the different political party leaders, where they could speak directly to the public on what they stood for. Of course, some of the gatherings were extremely chaotic, but I think it's been good to see that health in our media. However, of course, there's some media outlets that have been accused of a certain favoritism in terms of how they cover different political parties and the type of content that they put out there. I mean, there was the recent incident, I think just yesterday, where I think it was the ENCA that was supposed to have the MK party had requested to be on ENCA, and then ENCA had said no because they didn't want to cover any political party leaders 48 hours before the election, and then ENCA still had engagement with Rise Mzansi, and then that brought up questions about who owns the different media enterprises, which I think is a very fascinating conversation, and I think one that can be a completely separate one from this one. But yeah, in terms of how they've been engaging with this has been very interesting. In terms of radio specifically, and now I'm thinking, because I'm from the Eastern Cape, and one of the most popular radio stations in the country is Umhlobo FM. And Umhlobo FM has made a very concerted effort in voter education for these particular elections, where there's been a pivot in just focusing on specific political parties, but actually trying to explain to people in their mother tongues, of course, what does this voting thing mean? And I can imagine it's somewhat spread out across to the other radio stations with different languages. And I mean, I had an interview not so long ago with Radio Islam that traditionally doesn't necessarily have these types of conversations, but wanted people to come in and explain to their listeners about the election process. So I think there's been a concerted effort from media to cover these elections as broadly as they can and as accessible as they can to their audience. But of course, there's been, as usual with any election cycle, questions about the financing behind these media outlets and whether or not that has impacted the type of content that the media is putting out when it comes to these elections.
Are we likely to see more women in office, or are we having a lot more women actually running for office in this year's election?
No. In
That breaks
terms
my
of
heart.
I don't think so, but there's quite a number of women running for premier candidate positions. I find it very interesting that there's not many women on the ballot who, you know, where South Africans can say, oh, I think we are ready for a woman president. And it's obviously a passion of mine too. I'm joining the Commission for Gender Equality very soon. And this is also a lens that I've been looking at. And again, I think this speaks to that intersectionality conversation that we had a bit earlier about the layered, complex and nuanced ways that parties should be engaging with this idea of representation. But more often than not, as we've seen before in the past, when it comes to the actual swearing in of representatives in the National Assembly, there is usually a pretty good representation of women when it comes to that. But even in that conversation, and I know now I'm leaving like on a complete cliffhanger, I always wonder if the representation of women in seats of parliament equates to the caring and the protection of women on the ground. But that's, you know, a story for another day, on whether or not we have representation in our parliament for the sake of quotas, or if it's actually meaningful representation when women actually do make it there. So I don't know. We'll see after this election how that is going to look like, particularly if we are going to go into coalitions, and how that representation of women is going to be looking like in Parliament.
Well, we'll still be on the lookout as well. Thank you so much for this conversation. I think it's been really great. And I think for anyone that doesn't have context of the South African election, this is a good way of like just getting yourself ready for what's going to be happening tomorrow. So do you have any final thoughts or reflections?
No, the biggest thing I just want to say is if you're someone that has registered to vote, well done. Now you just have to show up. Even if you don't know who you are voting for, whether you are voting on identity politics, whether you are voting on an issue-based matter, I just want you to show up tomorrow and exercise your right to vote. The bigger the pool of voters, the bigger the representation that we have. Your vote matters. Every single one counts. And if you even want to bring, I don't even know if this is legal, but I saw some people talking about wanting to bring cooler boxes and some braai situations there in the polls, please. Anything to make you feel excited about these elections. I think they're very exciting. It's exciting anytime when a person can exercise their right to vote. This is when your voice is heard, and please use it. And thank you.
Thank you so, so much, Yanga. This has been exciting, and all the best to you and everyone in South Africa that's showing up to vote tomorrow.
Thank you.
And thank you so much to our listeners. We'd love to hear your feedback and thoughts on today's episode. You can leave us a comment on the platform you're using to listen to this episode, or take us on a post on social media. Remember to share this podcast and follow Southern Defenders on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You can visit our website, www.southerndefenders.africa, to get a broader sense of the work of Southern Defenders. This is the Civic Space Today, a program of the Southern Defenders. I am Mandata Mlojwa, your host for today's episode. Thank you for tuning in and see you next time. Together, we defend.